I was sitting in a police interview room in the mid-sized Midwestern city where I had lived my entire life, with my friend and lawyer, Ralph Boston, sitting next to me. Ralph whispered to me for the second time in the last 5 minutes, "Lucas, I again advise you not to say anything. Just exercise your right to a lawyer. I'm Lucas Worthington." It's a top-class name, especially when combined with my pretentious, never-used middle name, Rockefeller, because my parents are so damn rich. I'm rich too, but not because of their money. I made my own as a .com specialist, so at 29 years old, I'm worth over $50,000. However, I don't belong to the upper class. I'm an ordinary guy who just happened to have money. I drink beer, play basketball, sit in the stands at baseball games, start brawls and fights, and spend at least 40 hours a week doing volunteer work, mostly, but not exclusively, for a charity I set up for disadvantaged children in the poor areas of my city. I'm about to be questioned by 2 detectives about the untimely murder of my beautiful but unfaithful wife, Ashley, and one of her lovers, Brad Sidley, which occurred a couple of nights ago at Sidley's apartment. I don't feel too bad about it because Ashley blossomed into a cheating gold digger from the moment she married me, and within the next 2 weeks I was going to file for divorce on the grounds of adultery. As for Brad Sidley, he was a total jerk who I beat the crap out of twice. Not because of Ashley, but simply because he was a loudmouth braggart who told me the wrong things at the wrong time. When experienced Detective Roy Benson entered the room, he was followed by a newcomer, Detective Will Watson, although Watson had already been a police officer for several years. How Watson was promoted to detective, I have no idea. He looks good and is a real talker, which some people find charming, but in my opinion, he is dumb as a plug. My eyebrows raised and I smiled inwardly. Benson began like this. "As I understand it, you are ready to talk to us, Lucas, despite the presence of a spokesman for your interests. First of all, Detective Benson, I am not your friend, so you will address me as Mr. Worthington," I said. But before I could finish my thought, Watson chuckled. Titled ass. I turned to Watson, looked straight at him and said, "You know, Will, every time I see you, I remember the movie Menagerie." A puzzled expression appeared on his face, but before he could say anything else, I continued, "I remember Dean Weremere telling Flounder, 'You can't live your whole life fat, dumb, and ugly, son.' Well, the quote is not entirely accurate, but close enough. You remind me so much of Flounder, and for the sake of facilitating this interrogation, keep your fat, stupid, ugly mouth shut, or I'll have to do to you the same thing I did in the locker room our junior year at good old Hudson High after football practice. You remember this, don't you, asshole?" It brought back pleasant memories for me, but not so much for Will. In the locker room after football practice, Watson called me a horny weakling and pushed me. I threw him on his ass, hugged him, and stuck his head in the toilet. So, I was suspended from the game, but it was worth it. "There's no reason to say that, Mr. Worthington," Benson snapped. "Then tell your dog on your knees to shut the fuck up. I would like to give answers to the questions, but I'm not going to put up with his behavior," I growled. Watson looked like he wanted to attack me, although he was too cowardly to do so. You may wonder why I was stupid enough to anger a cop who could have made my life difficult, but the reason will become clear later. Benson whispered something to Watson, and he leaned back in his chair, staring at me. Before I was so rudely interrupted, I was also going to say that this interview is only being conducted because your department has agreed to videotape the entire process, and in the understanding that the moment you lie to me the first time, it will all be over. Also, ask your questions efficiently, because I'll be done in 2 hours. "We don't agree to a time limit," Benson said, visibly annoyed. "Obviously, either you didn't talk to Chief Jackson or you didn't listen to him, because I made these terms clear to him and he accepted them. Do you agree, or can I leave now?" Benson and I looked at each other for 30 seconds before he said, "Okay, let's get started." I definitely took off my watch and started the timer function. Benson, with Watson only whispering to him if he wanted to ask something, because he knew that I would never answer any of his questions, began his interrogation. I answered all their questions honestly, although it was clear that they did not believe me because I knew that they would never be able to prove that it was I who killed my cheating wife or her lover. About an hour after Watson whispered something to Benson, he said, "How do you explain the presence of your DNA on Sidley's clothes?" I stopped the timer on my watch, put it on my wrist and said, "This is your first and only lie. Goodbye," and stood up, after which Ralph and I left. Benson and Watson shouted something after us, but I did not listen and did not attach any importance to their words. Ralph and I walked to his office, located just a few blocks from police headquarters, giggling to each other most of the way. As we entered the closed conference room, Ralph laughed. "I don't know who you are, the bravest or the stupidest client I've ever had. Can I be both?" I grinned. "Why were you so confident dealing with those cops, Lucas?" "For two reasons. Firstly, I didn't do it. And secondly, I have an undeniable alibi, supported by video recording, for the entire possible time of the murder, which, according to the medical examiner, was between noon and 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 5th of this month." Where is the video from? This is a video from a basketball clinic where I was tested in a city 90 miles from here, and the entire time of which is on video, starting at 11 a.m., an hour lunch break at 12:30, and ending before 4 p.m. It was filmed by a guy whose day job is a police videographer, but I paid him to film it at the clinic because I plan to use most of it for presentations at boys and girls clubs around the country in connection with my charity. I have a dozen copies in my safe at home. Let me ask the paralegal to go with you to get a copy for me." Ralph smiled. "Only after you treat me to lunch. Working with Watson and Benson made me hungry," I chuckled. 2 days later at 6:30 a.m., Watson and about half a dozen other cops served me a search warrant. I'm sure they wanted to wake me up and inconvenience me, but I had already been training for half an hour. Watson had a big shit-eater grin on his face when he served the warrant. "Have fun, idiot," I grumbled, taking out my bike to finish my workout outside. "Don't steal anything. All valuable things are listed in my catalog." Watson responded annoyed. "Fuck you." The two reasons I had no problem leaving them to search my house were because I had nothing to hide and because I had professionally hidden high-tech cameras in every room, which is how I originally caught Ashley cheating, though I never told her about this evidence. When I returned from my bike ride a little over an hour later, the police were already leaving. Watson saw me and with a wide grin handed me a bag of evidence, which, as it turned out, contained a gun. Since I didn't have a weapon, I knew it was planted, but I wasn't worried because the cameras showed it was planted. After checking the cameras, which took about an hour, I immediately called Ralph and brought him up to date. In 2 days, they were going to arrest me. Ralph's friend at the police station alerted him, and he and I showed up at the station just as the task force was about to move out to arrest me at my charity in the most public manner, having already arranged for the presence of 2 local television stations. They were very angry that I stole their glory. I just smiled. Ralph had already petitioned the fairest judge in the local court for a bail hearing the next morning. I spent only 1 night in prison. Those bastards put me in a cell with a real scumbag named Melvin Brixey, with whom I'm sure they agreed to beat me up. This also didn't work for 2 reasons. I caught Melvin off guard by telling him as soon as I walked into the cell that I knew the cops had promised him something if he beat me up. After that, I immediately told him that I was rich and that I was not a failure myself, and if he testified in my favor, then I would pay for the services of the best criminal lawyer in the area, who would take his case, and if he didn't like that deal, then he will be surprised by my physical reaction, and that I will not stop until one of us dies. Given his size and background, Melvin would have ended up beating me to a pulp, but he immediately liked me for my aggressive approach. When Ralph met with me the next day at my bail hearing, I told him that I was paying for Melvin's defense and asked his senior partner, a criminal defense lawyer, to meet with Melvin that same day. In parting, I shook Melvin's hand, and the 2 jailers who accompanied me looked at us with their mouths agape. The DA himself was present at the bail hearing. It was an election year. This is a complete asshole who dealt with my father when he was in private practice and got what he deserved. He treated the case as a high-profile one to ensure his re-election. He made very disparaging comments about me, which made me very angry. Luckily, Ralph has a much cooler head than I do, so he tempered the DA's arguments with logic instead of calling him the asshole that he was. Ralph also pointed out the disruption to my charity work that would occur if I was sent to prison, and that I was clearly not a flight risk. I was released on $2,000 cash bail and forced to hand over my passport, but without a wrist monitor. When I returned to Ralph's office, we had worked out our strategy in just over 2 hours. When we finished, we grinned. He immediately had his technical expert review the DVD of my alibi that I had given him. We put the relevant scenes from my home cameras during the police search into an easy-to-display format, and Ralph began contacting the alibi witnesses to tell them to cooperate less with the police. However, the first thing Ralph did was file a notice with the court that we were exercising our right under state and local law to have a trial within 90 days of my arrest, which was infinitely faster than the prosecutor and the court were accustomed to. Most criminal defendants, especially if they are out on bail, want to drag out the process as long as possible. Also, unlike most of the accused, I did not avoid the media. Gave interviews to every reporter who asked for it. Radio, television, newspapers, social media, whatever. In every interview, I called the district attorney an idiot who was incompetent and should be removed in the next election, and the police detectives handling my case as corrupt and ineffective, while praising the rest of the police force. I know for a fact that I angered a lot of people. That was my intention. The prosecutor appointed female prosecutor Suzanne Carney to lead the case. She was young, but already experienced, although she had just transferred to his office from a larger city after a messy divorce that I found out about when I found her on the internet. She was only 30, only a year older than me, and judging by the photographs, she was simply stunning. Although she was clearly intelligent and competent, having less than 90 days to prepare a case, when she had other responsibilities and was in a new work environment, was very difficult for her. So after she had the case for about 2 weeks, she asked for a plea conference with Ralph and me. We only agreed because I wanted to meet her. We went to her office where she was waiting with 2 assistant prosecutors, Benson, Watson, and an attractive, if strangely dressed young woman whose title was unknown to me and who was not introduced to us. Ralph and I were polite, but we didn't say much. Carney listed the highlights of her case. The murder weapon, a .380 caliber pistol, was found in my home during a search and was positively identified by ballistics, and my DNA was also found on it. The video of my alibi ends at 1:50 p.m., giving me enough time to commit the murder by 3 p.m., according to the medical examiner. I had a strong motive because Sidley and Ashley were having an affair, and getting rid of her was cheaper than divorcing her. And my history of quarrels with Sidley in the past, where she claimed Sidley had gotten the best of me, is clearly not true. But the source of this information was a friend of mine who, although not lying, reported it incorrectly. However, due to her generosity, she agreed to find me guilty of first-degree manslaughter with a sentence of 8 to 15 years in prison. As previously agreed during her speech, Ralph and I simply smiled. This seemed to unnerve everyone on her part. When she finished, I said, "Miss Carney, could we meet with you individually, without strangers?" This completely stunned her entire team. I can't do this. It is unethical to speak to you alone while being represented by an attorney. Actually, Miss Carney, Ralph smiled. Since both Mr. Worthington and I fully agree, there is no ethical problem, and we will both sign a statement to that effect. After a minute of awkward back and forth, I chuckled and said, "Please call your secretary, dictate this statement to her or him, and ask him or her to bring it here for me and Ralph to sign." Suzanne called her secretary, dictated what she wanted, and while we waited for the document, I engaged Suzanne in the most pleasant, non-legal conversation I could manage. smiling at her constantly. Less than 5 minutes later, her secretary, a man, came in with a document. After a quick look, Ralph and I signed it. The secretary and one of the assistant prosecutors witnessed our signatures, and the secretary left to make copies for us. After that, everyone left the room except me and Suzanne. As soon as the door closed, I began, "Suzanne, since you are relatively new here, I want to tell you some things that you may not know. Detective Watson is corrupt, and your boss, the district attorney, is incompetent. If you continue this case, both the police and your office will be completely disgraced. So disgraced that it will be difficult to recover from it. Others who work with you do not have your best interests at heart. Do you have something specific that you want to tell me?" She pouted. "No, I will leave this for the court if you decide to continue. Just a warning that nothing is as it seems, and you should take a closer look at the discovery of the gun and my alibi. I don't want you personally to get it for this. If you do not investigate further, I suggest you ask the district attorney to reassign the case." "Why do you care?" She pouted again. "Because I like you, and I'm looking for a new relationship since my cheating wife has passed away, and would like to get to know you better," I answered with a smile. Obviously, Suzanne was stunned because she just stared at me with her mouth open for 2 whole minutes. Finally, she regained the ability to speak and asked, "Are you serious, or is this some kind of trick?" "I'll tell you how serious I am. I know that your favorite artist is Bon Jovi, and on my iPhone, I will buy you and me 2 front-row tickets to his show in New York from a friend of mine for his next concert in exactly 123 days, and I invite you to come with me." I smiled, taking out my iPhone. After another long pause, she said, "You are crazy. Just tell me whether or not you accept my plea deal, which expires after today." "Miss Carney, I'm sorry if I upset you. Perhaps after finding me not guilty you will change your mind, and I will be as kind to you as I can. However, to answer your question, I reject your offer and any future plea bargains because I am innocent." At this moment, while she was still in a semi-shocked state, I quickly took her hand, kissed it, and left the room. As we were leaving the building, passing Watson, I gave him the middle finger. Ralph chuckled. "How did everything go?" he asked. "She turned down my offer of a date at a Bon Jovi concert in New York, but she was interested in me. I'll try again after the trial. Given what happens there, will she ever talk to you again?" "I hope so," I chuckled. "Maybe she'll develop a sense of humor." "Dream?" Ralph laughed. "I don't want to spoil the outcome of my trial for you in advance, but I have to say a few things. The DVD we gave the prosecution with my alibi appears to cut out at 1:50, but if you continue to play it for another 30 minutes, it resumes at 1:50 and shows me until it cuts off at 4 p.m. If the prosecutor's office or the cops had continued to play it instead of cutting it off at static, they would have seen it. In addition, the prosecutor's office was under the impression that Ashley and I did not have a prenuptial agreement, but there was one, although the only people who knew about it were my business lawyer Ralph and her friend, who witnessed the signing, but now lives over 2,000 miles. We listed her as a witness on a long list, but the prosecution was never able to contact her, and under local rules, we were not required to reveal what witnesses might say. Fortunately, we got a good but unsentimental judge, although, given the strength of our case, anyone would have been suitable. The jury was selected in just 2 hours. Our jury consultant and Ralph were pleased. Although we felt we were doing well, there was no reason not to select good jurors. The prosecution began with the medical examiner presenting photographs of the gruesome death and the time and cause of death. Between noon and 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 5th, 2 .380 caliber bullet wounds to Sidley's head and a through one, from which Ashley died, were his main statements. Ralph's only cross-examination was aimed at establishing the exact time and manner of death. The police witness who assessed my financial situation testified how much money I would have to pay Ashley if we divorced, since adultery is not grounds for divorce proceedings, and there is no evidence of a prenuptial agreement. Ralph scored many points by introducing into evidence a prenuptial agreement that limited her payment in the event of a divorce due to infidelity to only $50,000, and in the event of a divorcee for any other reason to only 1,000 Ts. Ralph also embarrassed the witness by asking if she had ever tried to contact my business lawyer to see if there was a prenuptial agreement, and not just based on what she had heard from Ashley's friends. Her answer, no, brought a look of disgust on the faces of several jurors. Suzanne then called a ballistics expert who positively identified the .380 caliber pistol found in my home as the murder weapon, and a DNA expert who testified that my DNA was on the weapon. Ralph cross-examined to make it clear that the ballistics expert did not personally know how the gun was found, and the DNA expert testified that there was no DNA on the bullets in the gun, and that, given the locations on the gun where DNA was found, she could have gotten there by transference. Up until this point, Suzanne seemed confident. She got her first real indication that her case was falling apart when she called her star witness, Detective Will Watson. Watson testified about the search warrant for my home, how within 30 minutes Corporal Cheryl Billings, one of the officers conducting the search, found the gun, called Detective Watson, picked it up in his gloved hands and put it in an evidence bag, while Detective Watson looked at it. His testimony only took about 20 minutes. When Ralph stood up for cross-examination, he held in his hand the remote control for the courtroom's large screen projector. "Detective Watson, what were you wearing on the day of the search?" asked Ralph. I don't remember." Ralph showed a photo taken outside my house with all sorts of police officers around, taken by a camera on the front door, which showed him wearing dark blue trousers, a light blue long-sleeve shirt, a distinctive red and yellow tie, black dress shoes, and a tweed sports jacket that seemed bulky. "Is this a photograph of you on the day of the search, showing your clothes?" Yes, it seems like that," Watson replied. "I didn't ask you if it was similar, whether your clothes on the day of the search are shown in this photo or not. If necessary, we can call Corporal Billings or other officers to testify." Ralph growled with hostility. Yes. This is exactly how I was dressed on the day of the search." "How often do you wear this tie?" "It's not often, actually. It's a new tie, and since it was an important day, I decided to wear it," Watson replied. "Have you ever been to Mr. Worthington's house before the day of the search?" After a pause, beginning to suspect something, Watson replied, "I do not remember." "Don't remember. Are you friends with Mr. Worthington or his ex-wife Ashley?" "No." "What reason could you have for being in their house at any time other than during a search?" "I can't remember a single one." "You've never been to the Worthington house other than the day of the search, have you, Detective Watson?" Ralph growled. After another pause, Watson shifted in his chair and answered, "No." "Here's a video of someone taking a green toothbrush from Mr. Worthington's bathroom," Ralph continued immediately, showing the scene from the camera in my bathroom. "Is that you with your characteristic yellow and red tie, Detective Watson?" I've never seen this video before," he mumbled awkwardly. "Probably not," Ralph chuckled. "Just answer the question." After another delay, yes. "Similarly, are you the one who takes some of the red and white clothes from the laundry basket in Mr. Worthington's laundry?" Another delay, yes. "Did you take the gun out from under your tweed jacket in Mr. Worthington's closet, rubbed it with the green bristles of a toothbrush, then rubbed it on your red and white shirt, and then put it in the top drawer of the closet near the window in Mr. Worthington's closet?" A shocked Watson stared silently at the screen as the video was played 3 times in a row. "I claim the Fifth Amendment," he said breathlessly. "Did you have an affair with Mr. Worthington's wife, Ashley?" A shocked Watson muttered so quietly that the court reporter asked him to speak up. "I insist on the Fifth Amendment. Here's a video taken 2 weeks before the murder of you and Ashley having sex in one of Mr. Worthington's guest bedrooms." After visually showing the sex tape for 15 seconds, the judge said, "You can turn off the video, Mr. Boston. We get the point." "Answer the question, Detective Watson." He muttered, "I claim the Fifth Amendment." There are no more questions, Ralph declared. The entire courtroom stared at Suzanne as she slowly stood up. Your Honor, can we take a break? You definitely need him, Miss Carney. We'll meet in 2 hours, the judge said, and then banged her gavel. All the jurors either smiled or shook their heads. Detective Benson was in the courtroom. I approached him and asked, Are you going to arrest Watson now? He had a glazed expression on his face, but he answered, I don't have a warrant. But there are sufficient grounds for charges, if not of murder, then at least of tampering with evidence, I answered. Murder? He gasped. Who the hell do you think killed Ashley and Sidley? This is the guy who planted the murder weapon. Take courage, Benson, and arrest him, I growled. To my surprise, Benson nodded to the bailiff, and the two of them placed Watson under arrest. While we were having lunch, Suzanne called Ralph. She wanted to meet. We expected her to say she was withdrawing from the case. To our surprise, she said instead, I talked to the district attorney, and he said we'll accept a guilty plea to second-degree manslaughter, just 2 years in prison. Outraged, I shouted, Are you telling me that the asshole Watson who killed my wife will only get 2 years? Suzanne, who had the decency to look embarrassed, replied, No, I'm offering this plea agreement to you because we believe you likely had some kind of relationship with Watson. I was speechless. I came at her with such an angry tirade that she looked scared to death, and it was only because Ralph had the strength and size to hold me back that I didn't hit her in the face. I would never have hurt her, but outwardly, I was angry more than ever. As we ran out of the conference room, I shouted, Fuck you, bitch! Ralph thwarted my anger when, as he led me away, he whispered, Does that mean you won't take her to the Bon Jovi concert in New York? I stared at him for a few seconds, still burning with anger, and then burst out laughing. When we reconvened after a 2-hour delay, the judge called the lawyers to the stand. They were talking animatedly. When Ralph returned, I asked him what was the matter. He said, The judge assumed that Suzanne would throw out the lawsuit due to prejudice. When she refused, the judge reprimanded her, but she did not budge, saying that the prosecutor wanted her to continue.